Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Welcome. I'm Eve Stern. I'm the director of URI's Center for the Humanities. Welcome to URI, where we are on the traditional stomping grounds of the Narragansett Nation and the Niantic people. I am really thrilled to be here today to welcome Eric Gottesman to give the first talk in the spring edition of our year-long series, Sustaining Democracy. My colleague Anu Matthew will introduce Professor Gottesman, and then after his talk, we'll have time for questions and answers. And at that point, I'll come around with the microphone so that the people watching on the live stream can hear your questions better. So welcome, Professor Matthew.
Okay, thank you, Eve, and thank you to the center. In 2016, 4 artists had the audacity to create a super PAC called 4 Freedoms to spark new conversations about politics. Time magazine called it the largest creative collaboration in United States history. The name for 4 Freedoms riffs on Roosevelt's iconic 4 Freedoms speech in 1941, a call for fundamental human rights, and it also questions and expands on the painter-illustrator Norman Rockwell's idealized and non-inclusive interpretations of these freedoms. Freedom of speech and worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. One of those founding artists for the Super PAC 4 Freedoms, Eric Gottesman, joins us today. He's a Guggenheim Fellow, creative capital artist, and a Fulbright Fellow. In addition to his artistic work, which is very collaborative, Gottesman is currently the W.W. Corcoran Visiting Professor in Community Engagement at George Washington University and a mentor in the Arab Documentary Photography Program in Beirut, Lebanon. Especially in light of the recent removal of the 4 Freedoms billboard in Montgomery, Alabama, we're excited to hear Eric's thoughts in this talk. Where can we go from here? Thank you. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you, Anu, and thank you, Eve. Thank you all for coming tonight and for having me here. Something I've been thinking about the last few days made me think that I want to start out this conversation a little differently than I normally would. I'm going to invite you to close your eyes for a moment. And I want you to think about a time in your life where you experienced pain. It can be physical pain, psychological pain, emotional pain. I want you to think about what that felt like, what you did with that pain, how you coped with it. Did you confront it? Is it still with you? And how do you release it? I think there's a lot of pain right now, a lot of unprocessed pain. You could probably feel it in this room. You can open your eyes. I think right now is an important time for artists and for art students to be making work. It's a time where there's a lot of pain, and for me, in my work, art has always been a way to release pain, to confront it, to figure out what to do with it, to express it, to work with others to express it. And thank God there are those vehicles for that, because I think we're seeing at mass scale a moment of unprocessed pain. And in some ways it's no different than any other time in history, and in some ways it feels very specific. But a lot of my work, I'm gonna show you some of my work tonight. I did not start out as a photographer. I did not start out as an artist. I had a great lunch today with Ezra and Logan and Lay. They're way ahead of me at their age of what kind of artwork I was making, because I really didn't study it. I thought I was going to go to law school. I studied history. I thought I was going to go to law school, and went to Washington, D.C., and was working at the Supreme Court of the United States, thinking that I would work on human rights and sort of international law. And I realized that I needed to be more in person with somebody. I needed to have more experiences. And photography, I'd taken one class in college that was photography, and I realized that something really key about photography for me was the fact that I had to be with somebody else to make it, at least the way I was making photographs. And that relationship that I was creating with somebody, even if it lasted for a fraction of a second, it was a microcosm of a lot of larger things in the world. And it was a way to connect with somebody else. I'm going to show you some of my own work briefly, and then I'm going to go into this project that Anu started to describe, For Freedoms, which is a very large-scale project. But my own work really started in a very small scale. So after I was working at the Supreme Court of the United States, I got a call from the one professor that I took a photo class with, and he said, "Hey, would you like to go on a fellowship to make pictures?" And I was like, "Sure. I don't know anything about photography, but yes, I would love to." And he said, "Okay, great. You could go to Guatemala, South Africa, Philadelphia, or Ethiopia." And I said, "Great. I don't know anything about most of those places, but I'll go." So I ended up going to Ethiopia, which I knew very little about. And what I found there was that I actually did know something about Ethiopia, and it came from the images that I saw as a kid growing up in the United States. And at that time, in the mid-'80s, there was a famine going on in the country, and I had learned about what Ethiopia and people in Ethiopia looked like through these images. And they were images of starving people and people kind of in their most desperate moments. And I realized that there was a reason that I, in the United States, was seeing those images. There's a way in which there's a currency to images of suffering that is how the entire world economy works. But as soon as I landed there, I realized that I knew very little about that history of image making, of photography, of people in Ethiopia. And so I really took some time to learn the history of Ethiopia, the history of photography there. For the first 6 months, I didn't take any pictures. And then I started making a series of pictures in 1999 of people living with HIV who were not willing to show me their face. And the reason was it was a highly stigmatized disease at that moment in Ethiopia, just as it was here in the 70s and 80s. So the first series I made were photographs that I took with a Polaroid positive-negative camera, positive-negative film, where I could pull the film out of the camera and the subject could determine with me whether or not the photograph was acceptable. And if it wasn't, we would destroy it right there. And if it was, they would sign a permission form. And in that way, I was inviting somebody else into the making of the picture. It wasn't just me as a photographer holding the camera with all the power. It was also the subject of the photograph. I had also studied with Holly's sister, Wendy Ewald, who's a photographer who has always been a mentor of mine. And a lot of her work, if you guys don't know her work, you should check it out. A lot of her work is about teaching, and teaching as a form of image making. She says she teaches in order to make the images she didn't know how to see. And so I kind of took that page out of her book and worked with a group of kids in one neighborhood in Ethiopia for the next 10 years on a project called Sudden Flowers, where this group of kids and I made pictures together. Sometimes I was making the pictures, Sometimes they were making the pictures. Sometimes we would set it up together. This is a photograph by Mesfin Muhammad, and the title is, "If I Were Not Who I Am, I Would Be an Old Man." And the kinds of assignments and representation really expanded and complexified the way that these kids appeared in these photographs and were represented. We took these pictures around in a traveling exhibition that traveled all around Ethiopia, in small villages and towns. We put it in the back of a pickup truck, wrap all these. I worked with local metalsmiths and fabricators to make this installation that all wrapped up and fit in the back of the pickup, and we'd drive from town to town, village to village. And it was often, young people on the street who would be the first ones to help us set up. It wasn't just me, it was also the people that were taking the pictures that were traveling around with me. And we would serve coffee. It was in a circle like the Ethiopian coffee ceremony, and we would serve coffee and sit late into the night and look at their pictures and talk about them together and read letters that they had written. I'm going very quickly through my own work in order to get to Four Freedoms, but I'll just mention a couple of other projects. This is a project that Wendy Ewald and I collaborated on up in Labrador. She had been up there 40 years before and made photographs with a group of young people, young Innu people, indigenous people in Labrador. And we brought those pictures back 40 years later and started a project where we were trying to figure out what those pictures might mean in the community. And so one of the things we did is that we collected old photographs from people's archives and their homes, and we put them on a Facebook group and asked people to interact with them. And often it was the first time they were seeing their relatives. So we made some of these photographs into banners and hung them around the community based on what people in the community decided they wanted to see. And so we had a bunch of pictures, we held an exhibition, people voted on the images they wanted to see around their community, and those were the images that we turned into these large banners that hung on the school and the water tower, inside the main Innu Nation Hall. And in people's homes and tents. So again, this was another way of thinking. If you think back to the other projects I've shown you so far, these are all ways that I'm trying to get other people involved in the image making process. To me, I always say, I've never made an artwork alone. I've never made an artwork by myself. And in fact, I don't believe anybody has ever made an artwork by themselves. There's always some level of collaboration or interaction, even if it's with the people who made the materials that you use, that needs to be considered and that needs to be put into context in terms of what it is that we're doing. There's such a myth around individualism and art making that I think is really detrimental to thinking about what creation and art can mean, can be, how it can be a healing thing, not only for us individually, but for our societies. I went back to Ethiopia years later and worked on a project where I was translating a novel. Speaking of art as a force for healing, this novel was written by a man named Balu Girma. It's a novel called Oromai. He's an Ethiopian journalist that turned into the minister of propaganda under the Derg regime in the 1970s and 80s. This was a corrupt communist regime in Ethiopia, massacred hundreds of thousands of people. In 1984, he wrote a novel, navigated its way through the censorship boards, and put it out there. 5 months later, he disappeared, never to be seen again, because the novel was critical of the regime that he worked for. And so I was struck by the fact that this man knew that his artwork, his fiction, was going to put himself at risk, and yet he put it out there anyway. what does that mean? Like, what is that? It's so striking to me still. And so I brought that novel back. I translated some of it into English, and then I translated a lot of it into images and videos and texts, working with different people in Ethiopia, and specifically with artists. These are filmmakers and actors. They're still facing some of the same suppression of creative expression today. And we took scenes from the book or scenes from the writer's life and made them into these photographs together. This is another chapter. I've arranged that project into chapters, and one of the chapters that we were talking about at lunch today is called Scramble for the Sky, where I've, in looking at the construction that's part of the rapid economic development in Ethiopia, one of the questions that I had is, what allows this economic development to happen? And part of it is the political suppression of free speech. It makes economic growth much easier. So I wanted to make photographs that made these new buildings and this new construction look less permanent, less solid. I used a tilt-shift lens to kind of make it into something that looks more like an artificial maquette or a dollhouse or something. All right, last project before Four Freedoms, and then I'll jump into Four Freedoms. So my mother's family is from Lebanon, and I was always really curious about going to Lebanon, having heard about it from my grandparents and my mom. So in 2006, I went there after a different war with Israel. And in the south, in one of the villages that was bombed, I worked with a group of kids to make photographs that mapped the memories of what their town was before it was destroyed. This is Wissam's photograph. I remember where I broke my leg. Then we would take these photographs and place their memories into the rubble from the war. And we left them there, and that was the end of the project. This is documentation of leaving those photographs in the rubble. They were like these kind of temporary monuments in a way to what these kids remembered about their village. Okay. That's 20 years in 20 minutes. Now I'm going to spend the rest of the time on a project that I've been working on actually the last 9 years, which is called Four Freedoms. And all of those works that I just showed you were all like very intimate collaborations. Like I was collaborating with one person or one community or one neighborhood. This next project is really thinking about collaboration, artistic collaboration at the largest scale, at the scale of nationalism, really. So as Anu mentioned, in 1941, Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood before Congress on January 6th, 1941. Yeah, interesting date. And he gave a speech that came to be known as the Four Freedoms speech. And in that speech, he was making the case to Congress that the United States should enter World War II. And as part of that speech, he said every person in the world is entitled to four essential freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. 2 years later, there was a contest to illustrate those four freedoms, and Norman Rockwell, one of the greatest illustrators of all time, and at that time certainly was a prominent artist, made these paintings to illustrate those four freedoms for this competition. He lost, but these paintings were made, and what ended up happening with them was that they were turned into illustrations that ran on the cover of a very prominent magazine at the time, the Saturday Evening Post, and they became these iconic images of what it meant to be American. What do you notice about these images? Does anybody recognize any of these pictures? Yeah. Some yes, some no? Okay. What do you notice about these pictures? That's one thing. Say what? heteronormative. Yeah, the couples are both man and woman. Yeah, the only person of color that I can recognize is this woman up here under these words stuck up in the corner. These images, oh yeah, go ahead. That's great. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, even in the image of worship, you've basically got Christianity, and I would say mostly Protestantism. The one priest is hiding his rosary beads kind of behind the other people, right? And yeah, there is. These have come to be very hopeful images. And they kind of are, they make these values into heroic values, right? We were interested in them because, what I realized from those first 20 years of art making is that all of the work that I was doing was engaged in politics in some way, broadly defined, not in like left-right Republican Democrat politics, but in what it means to be to be engaged in society, critiquing of society, participating in society. Rockwell, after he made these paintings and after they ran in the magazine, gave them to the Office of War Information to allow them to make posters of these that were sold to raise $140 million for the war effort. So these paintings were actually literal propaganda raising money for the U.S. war effort in World War II. So I was really interested in that artists could think about their work as literal propaganda, but what else could art do that is politics, right? More on that in a bit. But one of the first things that we did in 2018 was to make Rockwell's photographs, remake Rockwell's paintings. My partner on the project, Hank Willis Thomas, and photographer Emily Shore and Wyatt Gallery, and I worked to make these photographs. We invited all the people that we knew. These were shot in Los Angeles. And we really thought about like what it would look like to remake those images, but have them be more representative. And as we got into it, we realized it's really hard to just make 4. What does a Muslim look like? What does a Jew look like? What does a Christian person look like? What does an indigenous spiritual practice look like? How do you define all the many identities, often overlapping identities, that exist within the United States? What does an immigrant look like? Nobody looks like Jesse Williams except Jesse Williams. So what we ended up doing is making these pictures. We thought we were going to make 4 pictures, but we ended up making, I think, 83. And there was something in the accumulation of all these representations of what it means to be American that was really important. Now, this was in the lead up to the 2018 election, so this was right before the midterm election. And Time magazine had run cover after cover after cover showing Donald Trump on the cover and some, crazy, whacked out sort of illustration. And so we happen to know the editor, one of the photo editors there, and we called him and he said, hey, we have this cool project that we've been working on. Would you guys be interested in running it? And he said, yeah, let me try to do it. And so he brought it to his managing editor, and they didn't do it. They ended up running a short online profile about what the pictures meant, which was great. We were very happy about that. Then, in the lead up to the election, there were all these artists and creative people and celebrities that were mobilizing around the election, and we happened to meet some of them and show them the pictures, and they were like, oh, cool, let's put these out on our social media. And so like Alicia Keys and Tom Hanks and like Taraji B. Henson and all these famous people that, you know, it was wild that we had access to, put them out on their Instagram, which reached tens of millions of people. And then Time Magazine called us and said, hey, you know what would be a great idea? Let's run it on the cover. So we ended up showing these in exhibitions, making posters and putting them all around the country, and running it on the cover of Time Magazine. And I think, to me, that was one of the many times that we learned this lesson that hacking the media is a way for art to have like an amplification and to reach a more democratic audience. It shouldn't be the reason, I think, for artists to make work, but there's some way of thinking about how to get it out there that goes beyond the ways that we artists think about putting work out in the world, right? So, you know, I'm going to back up 2 years because we actually started in 2016. I jumped to 2018 when we made these pictures, but I'll start it in 2016 when we held an exhibition in Chelsea in New York at a commercial gallery called Jack Shaman Gallery. And we invited all our friends and all of the people that we admired who were making artwork about the most important issues in our time to be part of an exhibition. And then one of the people at the exhibition said, hey, what if we did start as a super PAC. We're no longer a super PAC, but we did start as a super PAC. I don't know, does anybody know what a super PAC is? I want to venture a guess. Super PAC, P-A-C, is a political action committee. It's basically like a political advertising firm. It's an organization that creates ads for political candidates. We thought it would be funny and kind of interesting to make the point that artists are also engaged with politics by starting a political action committee. We thought it was a performance. We bought these suits, you know, to wear and look like we were political operatives. And we thought we were going to do it for a year and just perform this role to make the point that, like, art is politics, money is engaged in both of those things. You know, cool. But once we got into it, it got a lot more complicated and interesting. So one of the things that we did after this exhibition was we took the artworks in the exhibition and we made them into billboards. And we put 10 billboards in 2016 across the country. This billboard is in Pearl, Mississippi. The image is from a photographer named Spider Martin, who was a photographer of the civil rights movement, who made photographs, including this one, like important civil rights photographs, including this one on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, on March 5th, 1963, when peaceful protesters were walking across the bridge, including John Lewis, who's at the front of the line there, on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side were Alabama state troopers who were coming to shut the protesters down, tell them to move back, or they were going to shoot. So what happened in that moment is that the troopers did beat and gas these peaceful protesters. And those images made their way all across the country and mobilized a greater movement for civil rights. We wanted to put, in the lead up to the 2016 election, Donald Trump's slogan on top of these, in part to ask the question about the political slogan, what does again mean? When are we going back to? Are we going back to this moment? When was America greater than it was in 2016? Was it this moment when political protesters were pushing for civil rights. What was interesting to us is that some people saw this image, and really we put it up without context. We were kind of trying to be provocative. We put it up without context. Some people thought, oh, Make America Great Again, this is a pro-Donald Trump billboard. And the viewers that believed in that were looking at this image and associating positively with the police on the left-hand side of the image. Other people said, oh, this is, these are liberal agitators putting this image up to stir up racial history in the South. And those people were kind of like associating with, or assuming that we were associated with the right-hand side of the image. CNN reported that Mississippi residents were unsure of controversial billboards' intent. And to get CNN to report on people being unsure of what they think is like quite a feat, I think. It's usually like World Wrestling Federation, like this person slams the other person, I mean, reporting on nuance was actually kind of something that we were trying to do. So that became a seed of an idea, and that grew in 2018, not only in making the pictures that I showed you before, but in what we called the 50-State Initiative, where we ended up doing not only billboards, but other exhibitions and town hall meetings, public lawn signs and public programs all across the country in all 50 states, as well as Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. We created a toolkit that had a bunch of information about who we were and ways that people could participate. And the way we raised money for this thing was the way political candidates do. We did phonathons. We called people. We ran a Kickstarter campaign, which raised $5,000 in every state. Kickstarter, up until that point, had not allowed people to do anything except one campaign per project. For this project, they let us do 52 campaigns, 50, one for each state, plus Puerto Rico and D.C. So if we raise $5,000 in that state, we could do a billboard in that state. And we raised all of it. And we did these four things. We did billboards, lawn signs, town halls, and exhibitions that year. It was a way for us to activate an existing creative community that runs through the infrastructure of the United States. So we really started to think about the artist communities and museums and galleries and art schools as an infrastructure, like as a networked infrastructure that could be activated. This is in St. Louis at the Contemporary Art Museum. This was at the Mandeville Gallery at Union College. Those are signs that we put up, that we made, that said freedom from blank, freedom of blank. And this was the first time we did it at the Brooklyn Museum, where we made this balloon sculpture, which, who knew balloon sculptures were so expensive? They are really expensive. But we had people fill out these lawn signs, usually used for advocating for a candidate, to advocate for like a greater definition of what freedom could mean. And then we would put them outside, sometimes on walls, like at Afropunk, sometimes at the Brooklyn Museum on the lawn. We also did exhibitions. This is at the Corcoran Gallery in Washington, D.C. This is by Zoe Buckman. And then we did billboards. And the billboards in 2018, whereas in 2016 we did 10 of them, in 2018 we started doing them all over the country. This is Christine's son, Kim, in Jefferson City, Missouri. Kenneth Tam. I don't know if you can read that. It says, Asians have been here longer than cowboys. It's Alfredo Yar, who, there were a lot of artists who had been using billboards previous to us, Alfredo Jar, Guerrilla Girls, Felix Gonzalez Torres, Mike Mandel, and Sultan, Larry Sultan. So we were building on a history, an art history of artists using public space. This is Emily Hamako Momohara using an image from her family's archive. Her family was interned in a internment camp, a Japanese internment camp in Idaho. And I say public space, but actually this is private space. It's in public, but this is private media. These are private media companies, and they can decide what goes on and what does not go on these billboards. This became a really interesting thing for us to think about in terms of free speech. It'll come up again later, but I'll give you an example here. This is the artist Jamila El-Sahili, Lebanese-American artist, who made this billboard, which reads Ansan, which in Arabic means human being. At the time, in 2018, when we put this billboard up in Lansing, Michigan, people thought this was terrorism. They thought it was ISIS, and they were threatened, and they called the billboard companies to try to get it taken down, which just revealed the kind of, expectations and language that people expect or don't tolerate. So it is public, but these are private spaces. And in every campaign that we've run, we've had billboards that the billboard company says, nope, we're not going to run that. This is Theaster Gates. Paula Crown. This is at the seat of the first federal government in New York at Federal Hall, and we hung these billboards up there. And sometimes, when the billboard company won't allow us to put up an image or a message, we have to find other ways to get it up. In certain cases, that means that we'll build a structure to put it up. There are 4 states, let's see, Vermont, Maine, Hawaii, and Alaska that outlaw billboards entirely because they think billboards are terrible, which they are. Billboards are pretty ugly, actually. And part of the reason we wanted to wade into this was not because we believe in billboards as a space, but because they exist. And even within corrupt systems, we want to be able to participate. This is a billboard by Hank Willis Thomas, one of my co-founders. And he made this right around the time that Black Lives Matter was starting. And in relationship to Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter was starting. And so he was interested in taking out the V and leaving the All Lives Matter. At the time, he was thinking about kind of what he calls a missed opportunity for Black Lives Matter to incorporate All Lives Matter. To say, oh, you say All Lives Matter? Well, that means Black Lives Matter, right? And instead, it became this kind of binary thing where it was like, Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, like in all these different ways of sort of claiming territory. Interestingly, 5 years later, he made that in 2015. We put this up in 2018. We put it up again in 2020 in the midst of the George Floyd uprisings around the world. People thought it meant something very different then. We put it up again in 2024 at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. And it got banned, it got censored, because people thought this was too political. So this one artwork that he made changes its meaning over time. And a lot of these billboards do that. So we've worked with about 350 artists. This is Jenny Holzer. We've done, 550 artists. and we've worked with 300, we've done 350, no, sorry, 350 artists, 550 billboards. This is Brendan Mike Odoms. Aja Monet. And so we've done these billboards all over the country, and they've become a big part of what we do, in part because they're very visible, and people understand them, and media outlets like to report on them. But we've also held town halls, probably about 300 town halls in different institutions all around the country. Hold on, I'm going to just skip ahead here. I'm noticing there's some. Yeah. 300 town halls all over the country where artists are leading the conversation. So really, the idea there is that, you know, and this we learned from that Make America Great Again billboard. When you put work out there, there also needs to be a forum to unpack what it means. And so these town halls are often ways to kind of create discourse and dialogue around the artworks that we're putting out into the world. We've also, you know, done other projects that address other parts of this public discourse. So in 2022, we created For Freedom's News in the lobby of the Brooklyn Museum, where we set up a news desk and reported on the news. And we shot, for 2 weeks, we had a residency where we shot the news from an artist's perspective. We also are able to activate sites like the Four Freedoms Park in Roosevelt Island in New York City. This was a project where we had flying banners and artworks in public around the Women Life Freedom campaign in Iran. And because of the proximity of this place to the UN, which was right across the East River from Roosevelt Island, the US ambassador saw these artworks and came out to the island and asked, hey, what is this all about? And we got to give her a tour of the artworks. And they eventually passed the law removing the Republic of Iran from one of the councils at the UN. I can't remember which one. But it was. She said on that day, the U.S. ambassador came up to all the artists, many of whom were Iranian women, who said, and she said, you know, it was only because of you guys that we were able to push this through today. We've been wanting to do it for a long time, but there needed to be this kind of larger cultural support. Okay. I'm going over, and I want to leave enough time for questions. So I'm just going to mention a few other things. There's lots of other things that we've done over the years. One of the things that we did last year was we put all of our billboards into a book published by Phaidon Monticelli Press called Where Do We Go From Here? And Where Do We Go From Here is the title of Martin Luther King's last book. The subtitle of it is Community or Chaos. And that question, where do we go from here, has been so ever present for us throughout this whole project, because every time we do a new thing, rather than repeating ourselves over and over, we want to do something new. And I think that question ends up being a really essential creative question. Like, what next? What do we do? Where can we go from here? The book was a way to put all these artists together in one place. And what was cool was we had an event last fall at NYU where we brought a lot of the artists in the book together. And everybody had different stories about what the artwork, what their billboard meant for them in their own artistic practice, and what the life was beyond even the billboard itself. So right now, we are, this is an overview of the White House. And we have a residency right there. We're there for the next 3 years at the Corcoran School of Art and Design at George Washington University. We have a big studio. We have some gallery spaces. And we have space to program artists' work and exhibitions. It's also in collaboration with the National Gallery of Art, which is a federal institution. So it's subject to all federal laws and executive orders. So we're kind of embedded now within this institution. And again, this question is facing me and us, which is where do we go from here? You know, in this moment of, I don't even know what this moment is, but in this moment, like, how do we figure out what art can do in these places? How do we make space for asking more complex and nuanced questions in proximity to these very institutions that are creating the kind of chaos that I'm feeling? For me, hopefully these next few years are going to be about inviting the artistic community and the creative community in. But it's very complicated. Not only because we could get shut down, but also because there's a kind of atmosphere of fear. You know, Anu mentioned the billboard that I showed you, the Make America Great Again billboard. I mentioned Spider Martin's, the photographer Spider Martin, his estate is putting up an exhibition at the Museum of Fine Arts in Montgomery, Alabama. And as part of their exhibition, the photographer's family asked us if they could use our billboard. And we put it up. And then some 1819.com, you know, right-wing newspaper started writing about it down in Alabama, saying it needed to be taken down. The news started going up the food chain, and the mayor's office in Montgomery decided they wanted to take down that billboard. The mayor is a Democrat. So here you have right and left agreeing finally on one thing, which is our billboard has to get taken down. It's not the first time that's happened. The governor of Mississippi threatened to take it down in 2016, and we've had lots of politicians say that they were going to take things down, and we had to just kind of figure out how to navigate that. Even when, you know, A, we don't want anything to be censored, ever, but B, there's complex things happening in the air right now, in the atmosphere, and people are facing real fear and pressure. And so, you know, how do we actually get the work out there that we want to get out there, and also get artists involved, but do it in a way that's smart enough or, you know, slick enough that it doesn't put our partners at risk. So with that, I'm going to take a breath and let you guys ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. That was amazing. I'll come around with the mic so you can ask your questions.
Hi.
Hi.
That was very inspirational.
Oh, thanks.
That was very great. I love that. I have two questions. My first question is, what does it mean to you to be a part of something like this? And like, did you have any art featured as a billboard or just in this project in general? And what was it? Could you like describe it?
Yes. So what did it feel like? That is such a great, that is the right question. It has felt nerve-wracking at times. It has felt exciting. It has felt depressing. It has felt enraging. I feel like we're doing things so visibly and at such a scale that it really puts me emotionally and in some cases like reputationally or even legally at risk. It's like a roller coaster. And at the same time, what's come out of it is extremely gratifying, and the most gratifying thing is the community of artists that we've been able to mobilize around. So, it's always shocking to me to hear artists who know our work be like, oh my God, this has been such a part of my, like people feel like they own it too, which is like amazing. And so I've created like an incredible amount of friendships and a lot of hope out of the project. And yes, I have had billboards. Let's see. This one is mine, which was kind of based on a photograph, an FSA photograph of people standing in a bread line in front of a billboard that had this text, "There's no way like the American way." And I made this photograph on a project in Arkansas many years ago with a group of kids that were photographing what hope meant. So there's a portrait I made of this kid. But yeah, I've had lots of other artworks as well, installations, exhibitions. It's been a great vehicle for me. I never went the commercial gallery route. So it's been a really great way for me also to show my work. Yeah. I had to make space for my work, I guess.
Hi. I was just wondering, considering the nature of your work and how controversial it can be at times, how do you and your artistic peers and the people that you work with sort of protect yourselves? Because I know you mentioned that one person in particular who did go this sort of route in making controversial art and ended up facing severe consequences for it.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, how do you go about protecting yourselves and making sure that you're getting the messages that you want out there while also staying safe and keeping everybody in a good position so that they can keep continuing this work?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a great question too. So there's some boring ways to answer that question, which have to do with like our corporate entities. We created, so I, as an artist, how much do I want to talk about tax status? I as an artist, used to just make work and like I would get, if I got money for something, I would get the money and I'd file it with me on my taxes. When I started this project, I started a separate company that I called All of Us Incorporated. And I called it that because if I ever got sued, it would be like whoever it was versus all of us. And so my company and another company, created are co-owners of the third company. The third company is For Freedoms. So we created different layers of sort of financial protection for ourselves and liability protection. We've had to operate like an organization, so we have like various kinds of insurances. Eventually, we've sort of started and ended certain entities. So the super PAC that we started at the beginning became a way for people to say, oh, we can't work with you because you're a super PAC, you're a political organization. So we wound that down. Now we operate mainly out of a not-for-profit organization. And we have a board, and we're all in compliance with all the laws and stuff like that. So, so we've been very careful, like in terms of our, like what entity that we're doing this out of. That's only one piece of it, though. The other piece is sort of the PR strategy, right? Like, how do we talk about this work publicly? When this thing came up recently about the Make America Great Again thing, that was an exhibition that one of the many artists in our network was like, hey, can we use the billboard? And we were like, yeah, sure. Not really thinking it all the way through of like, if they put it up at this moment, it's going to create like an intense amount of heat. And so sometimes what we're trying to do is get attention, and sometimes what we're trying to do is like figure out how to moderate the attention that we know we're going to get from what we put up. Yeah. I mean, there's other ways of answering that question too, which have to do with, I mean, I'm very much involved in this now, is trying to figure out, like, economically, how do we sustain ourselves as an organization? And, you know, I guess, like, creatively, I've always been excited when there's controversy or feedback. I'm not trying necessarily always to just provoke that, but I'm excited about that. So to that extent, the whole project to me is an artwork. And the feedback that we get, whether it's legal or PR, you know, in the press or whatever, that's all part of the critique of the work. And at the core, I'm trying to think about how do we as people, as artists, both criticize and participate in these systems, these corrupted systems, whether they be democracy or art. And so for me, like, that unresolvability is a really important part of the overall project. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be all good or all bad. There's going to be people who disagree with it. And I've just had to learn sometimes the hard way to be okay with that. Yeah.
So it seems like you've had your experience both in leading organizations and in your artwork yourself. I wanted to ask, what are some, say in the last decade of your work, what are some life lessons that you've taken away from both of those things, and how do you apply them to your day-to-day life?
Ooh, you guys are killing me here. This is good. What are some lessons from my day-to-day life? Okay, one lesson I think is it's about, how would I say this? I think it's about transparency and honesty. It's about being open and vulnerable to and embracing that vulnerability. And I apply that, I mean, that's one of the things, and I apply that in my daily life in so many ways, in how I make work and how I think about how to do collaboration, and thinking about my kids, you know. Yeah, and then relatedly, I think one of the things I've really moved toward is thinking and acting from my heart rather than with my head. I've been so trained in my education and my culture and, you know, family that, like, intellect can save me. And I don't really believe that anymore. And I think there's something that connects us that's deeper than what we can think about or what we can rationalize. And that, to me, explains why I am doing this work from the lens of art rather than from the lens of advocacy or activism or something else. That there's something bigger that I'm trying to, like, reach for. How'd I do? Absolutely.
Do you have any specific events coming up in the near future, like in the coming months? I know you said you have meetings and expositions that you're doing, but what specifically is going to go on in the near future?
Yeah, so right now, until March 22nd, we have an exhibition in Washington, D.C. at the Corcoran. We have the Four Freedoms pictures up, as well as some of the actual billboards. They're enormous. They're like 40 by 60, 50 by 16 feet. So that's there. We are, we're going to be doing a film series at the National Gallery with artists who have been formerly incarcerated. We are, what else do we have coming up? We have a convening coming up in May. Basically, there's a bunch of different kinds of programming that's happening in Washington, D.C. at the Corcoran and at the National Gallery. I say that, but I don't know if you guys are following the news on this, but the National Gallery being a federal institution, you know, there's a question of what the federal government will allow arts institutions to do. One thing we did last week was we invited, I was just telling Eve about this, we invited an opera singer who has interviewed people all across the country about patriotism and turned their words verbatim into opera. And she performed it. And they were a vast variety. There were 4 sets of people. There were Black Americans, white working class Americans, New Americans, and Indigenous Americans. And so those words about patriotism were sung in the halls of the National Gallery. The same week that the executive order came down about patriotic education and the need for thinking about, you know, getting rid of DEI and all that stuff. So we're sitting here in a federal institution and she's singing about this stuff and I'm like, is this gonna, who's gonna come shut us down right now, you know? So there's like, it's weird. It's weird. It's a weird time to be there, but it's also like exactly the right time for artists to be embedded within that kind of place. Could end tomorrow. Like Melania could become the chief of the National Gallery tomorrow, you know? And that will be a very different set of like artworks. So everybody's kind of navigating that right now. It's a big question, you know, it's a big conversation I have with my wife who was working at USAID, which is also, you know, she's not working there anymore, but, you know, she is much more capable of existing within a bureaucracy that works at the scale of incremental change. I am not quite as patient, but I'm also now finding myself in a place where if I can be patient within that system, I may be able to do some really interesting things.
Hello.
Hello.
So, awesome speech. Loved
Thanks.
it. But I couldn't help but notice one thing. So, you originally started, well, I shouldn't say you, but you and your colleagues originally started Four Freedoms as a super PAC, correct?
Yes.
Why, in fact, do you want to talk more about why you turned into more of a nonprofit model than a super PAC?
Yeah, totally. So arts organizations, most museums are nonprofits, right? This is something to really think about critically, right? Why are museums nonprofits? Like what does that mean? It means that they can accept money tax deductibly from the government, but it also means they are non-political sites. They can't be political sites. If you're a political organization, you can't be a nonprofit, right? So when we were a super PAC, we were a political organization, even though we never did any political advertising. Like, we never advocate for candidates or anything like that. We just, we're interested in discourse around civic engagement and political engagement. So in 2017, we were still a super PAC, and at MoMA PS1 invited us to be in residence for 3 months. And we came up with a list of ideas, all these ideas we wanted to do at the museum. The curators were like, yes, let's do it. They're like, okay, let's run it up the chain. And they brought it to the lawyers eventually. And the lawyers were like, uh-oh, nope, you guys can't do this. We're like, why? They said, well, this is a political organization. And the curators were like, no, these are just these dopey artists that are, you know, like pretending to be a political organization. And they were like, it doesn't matter, they're registered as a political organization. And therefore, our tax status gets put at risk. And so people can't, if a museum loses its nonprofit tax status, that means they have to pay all the money in taxes. So most museums can't afford that, nor do they want to do that. And so that's when we switched over to become a 501c3. Well, at first we were, this is back into the logistics. At first we were a private company, and then we were a 501c3, which is a nonprofit organization. And the reason was because then we could collaborate with these museums and wouldn't put them at risk. So it's weird because it all depends on this definition of a museum as a non-profit, non-political organization, when in reality, what decisions any museum makes are inherently political, right? They inherently have, they may not be partisan, and we talk about our work as being anti-partisan. Like we don't believe in left or right or Democrat or Republican. We actually think those categories are limiting. But yeah, that's sort of how we migrated into nonprofit. And then we operated kind of in a hybrid model for a while where we had a for-profit and a nonprofit organization so that we could do different things. In the for-profit side, we did some brand collaborations with like Google and Converse and other companies that were interested in working with artists. And on the nonprofit side, we would raise money from philanthropy and do these projects. But a lot of the foundations wanted to see us move all of our operations into the nonprofit. And that's where a lot of our funding came from, so. Yeah.
Well, Eric, thank you so much for coming to
you
URI and
guys.
sharing your work with us. That was really inspiring. And thank you all for coming. It was great to have so many students with us today, and you all asked wonderful questions. So thank you, everyone. And also the people who joined us on the live stream. Have a great night.
Okay, good.